All right, it is 11 o'clock. This is Dr. Keegan Sawyer. I'm the director of this National Academy Studies on Gene Drive Research in Non-Human Organisms, Recommendations for Responsible Conduct. I am going to turn this over to Dr. Elizabeth Heitman, one of the co-chairs for the study, to introduce this webinar. Liz, when you are ready, unmute yourself. And
I believe I'm unmuted. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good morning, everyone, and thank you very much for joining us at a slightly different hour than our other webinars have been. We are pleased today also to welcome Dr. Katherine von Stackelberg and Dr. Bruce Hope, who are going to be our presenters today on a topic that has had a lot of attention from us, both in terms of how to begin to identify hazards from gene drive research and how to assess and identify first and assess the risks that we may face as this technology grows. And we're going to hear first from Dr. von Stackelberg. She is principal and owner of NEK Associates Limited. Her career has been dedicated to developing risk-based tools to support environmental decision-making, particularly with regard to economic benefits related to ecosystem services. And she'll have about 20 minutes to speak, and then Dr. Hope will speak. He has recently retired, but has been an environmental toxicologist for many years, most recently with the international consulting firm CH2M Hill, where he was particularly involved in risk assessment for human health and ecology. And prior to that, worked in the private sector with ecological risk assessment and management. We would ask that people save questions until both presentations have been finished. That will be, we hope, at 11:45. We'll have about 15 minutes. And if everyone would please mute your calls, I believe, looking at the list of call-in users, everyone is muted. But background noise tends, unfortunately, to travel much more readily than voices. So thank you all very much. Dr. von Stackelberg.
Thank you very much. Bruce and I are really welcome the opportunity to present a little something about risk assessment and how it can be used to support decision making. And what we thought we'd do today is go through sort of the process of risk assessment, providing some examples where we can and where it's appropriate from the gene drive literature. Not that it's an extensive literature, but there are some examples out there, as well as more broadly genetically modified organisms, and as well there are analogs from the invasive species literature where there have been some risk assessment approaches developed in that context that can be useful for our purposes today. In its broadest form, risk is the probability of some effect. It doesn't have to be adverse, but some, in this context, unintended consequence, which is a function of, again, broadly, some sort of exposure. Something has to be exposed, and then the intrinsic hazard or toxicity, the effects of the item being evaluated. And again, in the broadest terms, those two things together lead to the risk of some adverse effect occurring. So we start off with the environmental source of the stressors, the introduction to the environment, and very often, particularly in this case, there will be fate, transport, transformation, movement in the environment. We may cross boundaries. Things may happen, but ultimately that will lead to some sort of exposure to potentially an unintended target. And concurrently, if you will, there are, and typically this is based on laboratory and field, a combination of laboratory and field studies, some information about the toxicity or the hazard of the item in question. And those two things together lead to a probability of an adverse effect or risk occurring. Risk assessment as practiced currently and as given by guidance from the EPA, from the Environmental Protection Agency and others, and in the context of typically chemical exposures, a lot of these steps are basically deterministically evaluated, that is to say just sort of single point estimates. And I just want to show you that we can do a little bit better. We can actually use some probabilistic approaches. And this is taken from the EPA Risk Assessment Forum Working Group, a document that they put together some years ago now about using probabilistic methods. And this just shows you that in general, you know, the black and blue bars are these point estimates, but these inputs are actually well described by distributions, and we can have variability in the environment, and we also have uncertainty. This would be just showing sort of population variability in some inputs, and this kind of simplified diagram shows we have concentration and exposure duration. We put these together and we actually come up with a distribution of risk, which very often will be collapsed to these single values, but in fact are actually better represented by distributions rather than point estimates. In the context of ecological risk, and human health as well, but as ecological risk is typically practiced, there are two ways of thinking about, at least two ways of thinking about ecological risk assessment. One is the probability of an exceedance of a threshold, and this is the toxicity step, which really is a concentration or exposure or dose response function. In many cases, the way ecological risk assessment is practiced, that number actually becomes sort of a single number, which is a threshold level below which we do not expect adverse effects to occur. That's a rather simplistic representation, so we like to use these probabilistic approaches, but if you're really just using that, we can still calculate the probability of exceeding a threshold, or better, incorporating that entire concentration response function would be the probability of exceeding an increasing magnitude of effect. So for example, there's a 90% probability of a 20% reduction in reproductive capacity of the population, and there's some uncertainty bounds around that as well. Risk assessment always starts off with, and it's just really important, and without doing this, it really cannot proceed, is to develop the conceptual model, the decision context, basically. What is it that we are actually trying to calculate? And so here's an example from the literature, Carstens et al. 2012 in Transgenic Research. It's a conceptual model of DT exposure. And so this shows, thinking back to that first sort of flow chart, we have the introduction to the terrestrial environment, and then we have these processes that occur that ultimately lead to potentially unintended consequences in the aquatic environment. And these are the pathways by which that might occur. These letters actually represent a more detailed quantitative discussion in this citation of these pathways. And ultimately, that is the goal of the conceptual model. It kind of starts off as just a visual representation of what might be going on, but ultimately we want to get to the point where we are actually quantifying these pathways. And there may be underlying process models, there may be transfer factors, there may be different kinds of things going on here to make these predictions, but the goal is ultimately to have a conceptual model where we are able to ultimately quantify these pathways. Here's another example. This is from an invasive species application in Science in 2002. And again, we have an introduction to the environment, and then there's a probability that this species will be established. If it fails, well then we exit. But if it succeeds in establishing, then we go on to thinking about the probability of the spread of it, maybe fast or slow, and then the potential impact, and ultimately we get to a probability of the impact happening. And again, this is just another example of a conceptual model in the invasive species context. Another example is given here, and this shows a little bit about some computational frameworks that can be used. This is an example of a Bayesian network, which is a set of conditional probability tables that leads to the visualization of probability of invasion of this potential species. And again, here we have the conceptual model that we have dispersal and establishment. These two things together lead to a probability of invasion, and there's individual inputs here. These, of course, would differ depending on the specific context and what is being evaluated. But ultimately, this provides us with a very nice quantitative framework for determining and calculating the probability of an invasive species taking hold, if you will. And then this is a GIS, a map, which of course obviously for decision makers can be very useful to see where are the areas where something might happen versus areas where it might not. So there are a number of useful computational frameworks that can help us get at the probability of something occurring. I was able to find a few examples from the literature of risk assessments in the context of genetically modified or living modified organisms, if you will. I'm not sure if you're familiar with these, but thought I would just mention them. The Biosafety Clearinghouse is a European mechanism set up to assist folks, and actually within that there's an ad hoc technical expert group on risk assessment, and you see the link there, that actually has developed some risk assessment guidelines, and I didn't go into full detail, but there is quite a bit of information there, and it does look like some folks have really been thinking about that in this context. There are a couple of review articles. This one here, which is the open access, kind of draws some parallels between risk assessments for genetically modified organisms relative to how we calculate public health risks. A more recent article, and I've kind of jotted these all down and can provide a bibliography for you if that's useful. Transgenic Research, which seems to be a journal that has quite a lot of literature on this, just recently, in the last month or so actually, also had a review article on the genetic basis and detection of unintended effects in genetically modified crop plants, and kind of goes through the development and role of some emerging omics technologies and others to assist in the assessment of unintended effects, and that is the kind of input data that would need to be used in order to quantify the potential risk from the use of these kinds of technologies. Ecological risk assessment in particular is kind of moving in the direction of taking a step back and thinking about ecosystem services, and of course so this provides us now the opportunity to think about talking a little bit more about the decision context of risk assessment. It's not just a risk assessment. Of course, we want to actually think a little bit more holistically. We're starting with a decision. We're not just doing this for the sake of doing it. And so ecosystem services provides a context for ecological risk and also allows us to think a little bit about the potential benefits, because of course for something like this there are clearly benefits associated with the introduction of these kinds of technologies into the environment. And so I'll just bring up the point that EPA itself and others are moving in this direction, and the language of ecological risk assessment is being broadened now in this ecosystem service context. Thinking a little bit more about the decision context, decision analytic approaches can be extremely useful for evaluating different alternatives. This little sort of cartoon example is actually in the context of a remediation decision, but it's still applicable, which is there are different alternatives being considered, scenarios under which gene drive occurs, locations or contexts. You know, there are alternatives that you want to evaluate, and there are different criteria, including ecological risk, impact on habitat, potentially cost or community acceptability, various criteria which change given the possible alternatives. And this is a very useful framework for evaluating the kinds of trade-offs that can be made. And so ultimately you can get a ranking of your alternatives given what you've said your priorities are and the underlying values for each of these predictions, which of course involve disparate units and that sort of thing. And so these kinds of decision analytic frameworks allow you to kind of put that all on a level playing field. And again, I want to emphasize that, of course, there is a decision to be made, and so it's not just about the risk assessment itself, but how the risk assessment can inform the larger decision. And organizing that decision is a really important step. Organizing the inputs to that decision is a really important step. It's not going to tell you what to do, but given what you've said your priorities are, and these things also have weights associated with them that can be elicited from stakeholders or decision makers themselves, or different ways to structure that. But given what you've said your priorities are, you can obtain a ranking of the different alternatives. So with that, I'm actually going to turn it over to Bruce, who is going to provide some further insights and also kind of pull it all together for us. So Bruce, let me know when you want to advance slides, because I think I'm the one in control here, right?